The world isn't splitting the way you were told. You've heard this framed as democracy versus autocracy, freedom versus control, West versus East. But that story collapses the moment you look at who's actually under pressure right now, because the most aggressive resistance isn't coming from rising powers. It's coming from inside the system that's supposed to be winning. Everything feels chaotic. Policy reversals, alliance strain, markets twitching, leaders contradicting themselves on camera. But chaos doesn't usually repeat with this kind of precision, and it doesn't hit the same pressure points over and over unless something deeper is being targeted. Here's why this matters to you. The structure being stressed right now is the one that decides how money moves, how wars are justified, and how much sovereignty nations actually have. When that structure shifts, the effects don't stay at the top. They cascade downward into prices, into stability, into everyday life. But here's the part almost no one is willing to say out loud. What if this isn't a system failing under pressure, but a system being dismantled on purpose? Because if that's true, then what looks reckless is actually strategic. And once you see who the real adversary is, the rest of this story starts to snap into focus. What makes this moment hard to see is that it's being treated like a series of disconnected events. One decision here, one dispute there, one unusual statement brushed off as noise, but when you step back, a pattern starts to form, and it's not subtle. At the center of it is a quiet reframing of the problem itself. The core issue is no longer framed as hostile foreign powers threatening the system from the outside. Instead, the system itself is being treated as the risk, as something outdated, heavy, weaponized, less a shield, more a constraint. That's why moves that once would have been unthinkable are suddenly on the table. Alliances are questioned instead of defended. Long-standing assumptions are treated as negotiable. The language of permanence is replaced with the language of leverage. Notice what information keeps getting left out. You're rarely told what the end state is supposed to be. There's no clear blueprint offered, no glossy replacement vision. That omission isn't accidental, because naming the destination too early would trigger unified resistance from everyone invested in keeping things exactly as they are. So here's the question that reframes the entire issue. What if the instability isn't a mistake to be corrected, but a necessary phase of exiting a structure that no longer serves its members? Once you sit with that, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore. Here's the proof point that turns suspicion into pattern. When leaders believe in a system, they reinforce it quietly. When they no longer trust it, they start testing its limits in public. And that's exactly what's been happening. Long-standing commitments are reframed as conditional. Support is offered with fine print, guarantees are discussed then walked back, sometimes within days. Not behind closed doors. On camera, in official statements meant to be noticed. This isn't how confidence behaves, this is how leverage behaves. Watch the sequencing. First, the language shifts. What used to be ironclad becomes under review. Then the expectations change. Costs are emphasized, burdens are redistributed, responsibility is pushed outward while control stays centralized. Each move on its own is defensible. Together they redraw the map. Now notice what's missing. There's no emotional investment in preserving the old structure at all costs, no rallying call to restore it to its former state. Instead, there's distance, calculation, optionality. That absence is the tell. Here's why that detail changes everything. You don't expose pressure points in a system you're trying to save. You do it when you're deciding how much of it you actually need. And once that decision is made, escalation stops being reactive. It becomes procedural, because the next step isn't about defending the system anymore. It's about seeing how much of it can be shed without collapse. This is where the situation stops feeling like disagreement and starts feeling like drift turning into momentum. Once the old assumptions are loosened, everything accelerates. Reactions become louder, allies respond emotionally, Statements harden, then soften, then harden again. Emergency language creeps into normal governance. What would have triggered outrage a decade ago now passes as routine simply because it happens so often. There's a familiar pattern here. When a framework starts slipping, the instinct isn't to rethink it, it's to reinforce it. More declarations, more summits, more insistence that the foundation is solid. But history shows something uncomfortable. Systems don't shout when they're strong. They shout when they're trying to hold the line. Watch how quickly extraordinary measures get normalized. Economic pressure becomes open-ended. Security commitments are discussed as hypotheticals that never fully resolve. Pain is framed as necessary discipline, not a temporary cost. The language shifts from "until this ends" to "as long as it takes." Here's where the story flips. Normalization isn't stability. It's adaptation under stress. And when adaptation replaces consent, control becomes harder to maintain. Because once escalation becomes routine, it stops being something leaders manage. It becomes something they're trapped inside. Now comes the evidence that makes this impossible to unsee. Listen to the words, then watch the behavior. Publicly, leaders speak in absolutes: commitment, unity, shared destiny. But underneath that language, the actions tell a colder story. Funding is delayed, then restructured. Promises are narrowed, then redefined. Responsibilities are quietly shifted away from the center and pushed outward, while decision-making stays tightly held. That contradiction matters, because when words and actions diverge this consistently, it isn't confusion, it's strategy. Look at what they refuse to lock in. Open-ended guarantees, automatic responses, anything that removes flexibility. Every move preserves an exit ramp, even while insisting no exit is being considered. That's not confidence, that's risk management. Here's the line that permanently changes how this looks. Systems that expect to endure don't prepare for graceful withdrawal. They double down. What you're seeing instead is careful exposure reduction executed in plain sight. Once that clicks, a lot of behavior stops looking hypocritical and starts looking logical. The hesitation, the mixed signals, the sudden emphasis on burden sharing, these aren't policy debates. They're symptoms of an order trying to shrink itself without admitting it's doing so. And once that process begins, it doesn't pause, it accelerates. At this stage, pressure stops building in a straight line and starts stacking. One move triggers another before the consequences of the first are even felt. Diplomatic channels heat up, then suddenly go silent. Economic tools are deployed faster than their side effects can be measured. Security language tightens, then abruptly softens, then tightens again. None of these actions feel decisive on their own. Together they create constant motion without resolution. This is what systems look like when they're managing exposure instead of steering outcomes. Decisions are made to buy time, not to solve anything. Every response narrows the range of future options. Speed replaces deliberation. Momentum replaces strategy. Notice how urgency becomes the default tone, deadlines everywhere, windows closing, moments framed as now or never. That language isn't about opportunity, it's about pressure. It signals leaders reacting to forces they no longer fully control. Here's the question that starts to haunt this phase. What happens if the pace never slows down? Because systems under sustained stress rarely collapse all at once. They crack at the edges, quietly, in places no one was watching. And that's when the consequences stop staying abstract. This is where it reaches people who never asked to be part of it. When large systems destabilize, the first damage doesn't show up as dramatic collapse. It shows up as drag, prices that rise and never quite return, savings that feel less secure even when markets look calm, jobs that exist but feel conditional, governments asking for patience while offering fewer guarantees in return. You feel it in everyday decisions, whether to lock in a mortgage, whether to change careers, whether the rules that applied last year will still apply next year. None of that feels ideological, it feels personal. It feels like standing on ground that won't quite hold still. What's striking is how often people are told this is temporary, that once the next deal is signed or the next election passes, stability will come back. But lived experience keeps telling a different story. Volatility itself is becoming the baseline. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Not to argue, not to persuade, just to acknowledge what's happening on the ground, because this is how pressure really moves. Institutions offload risk downward, quietly, while insisting nothing fundamental has changed. And once that shift is complete, the real question isn't who's in charge, it's who's absorbing the cost. To understand why this pattern keeps repeating, you have to stop looking at ideology and start looking at incentives. Large systems don't move because they're right or wrong. They move to preserve leverage. Institutions protect whatever keeps them funded, insulated, and hard to challenge. When a structure starts failing, the instinct isn't reform, it's displacement. Shift responsibility outward. Keep control centralized. Let others absorb the volatility. That's why spectacle becomes so important. Big statements, emergency meetings, constant urgency. It creates the feeling of motion while avoiding structural change. Fear becomes a management tool. Confusion becomes a buffer. As long as people are focused on the next shock, they're not asking who designed the system to behave this way. Here's the unsettling insight. A system under threat doesn't need you to believe in it. It only needs you to believe there's no alternative. As long as questioning the structure feels riskier than enduring it, compliance holds. That's why reforms stall at the edges. Why accountability never quite reaches the center. The mechanism isn't broken, it's working as designed. Once you see that, the chaos stops feeling accidental. It starts feeling functional, and that forces a much harder question about where this trajectory actually leads. From here, the future doesn't move in a straight line. It branches. One path is controlled strain. The system holds together, but only by tightening constraints, more oversight, more conditional support, more management of behavior rather than outcomes. From the outside, it looks like resilience. From the inside, it feels like fatigue. Nothing breaks, but nothing relaxes either. Pressure becomes permanent. The other path is faster realignment. Commitments get rewritten. Dependencies unwind. Power shifts toward arrangements that prioritize flexibility over permanence. That transition is messy. It creates gaps, uncertainty, and sudden corrections. But it also reduces the need for constant emergency language. Risk moves again, just not where it used to sit. Pay attention to what's already changing. Leaders talk less about certainty and more about adaptability. Long-term guarantees quietly disappear. Optionality replaces permanence. That isn't optimism, it's preparation. The key detail is this: neither path waits for agreement. Momentum is already in motion, shaped by incentives that don't pause for public debate, and the next signal won't come as an announcement. It'll come as a decision that quietly closes one door and opens another. Here's the frame that makes the whole sequence make sense. What looks like disorder isn't the collapse of control, it's the reallocation of it. The noise, the contradictions, the unresolved crises all serve one function. They keep attention fixed on surface drama, while deeper commitments are quietly rewritten, not announced, adjusted. That's why nothing ever quite resolves. Resolution would require admitting the old structure no longer holds. Instead, instability becomes the environment where change can happen without consensus. Chaos isn't a bug, it's cover. Once you see that, the story rewinds cleanly. The pressure points, the hesitation, the mixed signals. They weren't mistakes. They were signals that the system was being tested for how much could be removed without triggering collapse. The real shift isn't coming with a headline. It's coming as a moment when the rules feel different and no one remembers exactly when they changed. If you want to understand what's being rebuilt underneath this transition, follow for deeper analysis, because the most important power shifts don't announce themselves. They settle in quietly, then shape everything that comes after.